being recorded. It's just going to start recording right now. Okay. All right. So, this is part of a lecture that's taken from my AJ-108 course, which is criminal investigation, and it covers um, specifically obtaining information and intelligence, meaning how do you go about not just conducting investigations, but how do you get the information in order to write your report? And again, that's a really important thing for all of you to know because, yeah, you're going to have to know how to get your information. And I threw in a video clip of an FBI interview, and part of this photo that you see, it's not just about some different traits that we'll talk about as far as being a good interviewer, but it's also how you set up your interview. And we'll talk about how you do that as well. Should you have just one person interviewing one person? Should it be two versus one? Should you have 10 cops in there and one person? Should you sit closer to the suspect or further away? The answer to that is it kind of depends on the situation that you're dealing with. So there's a lot of variables as it kind of comes to interview and interrogation. And also, if anybody has a question, just feel free to kind of throw your question out there, and we'll stop and we'll answer it, and then we'll keep going on. So some things that you need to know specifically is that knowledge obtained through questioning and physical evidence, they're both important. It's not just the bloody knife, the smoking gun, that you find on the ground, which is the physical evidence part, but the information that you get by talking to people is equally important. And you're going to find that out once you get into law enforcement. It really is communication and communication skills and writing are heavily weighed when it comes to being a good law enforcement officer, more specifically a detective, if that's where you want to go. Also understand that questioning can provide leads for finding physical evidence. So if you're a good, if you can talk to somebody, you're going to be able to elicit more information. Thus, that's going to help you find additional evidence. And not only that, even if you get a confession, somebody just confesses to you about something, it's going to have to be supported by physical evidence or some type of other corroboration. And really quick, can anybody tell me why we need that? Why is that last thing that I said, why is it important? Why would a confession need to be supported?
They
Because they
might,
could always deny it at the court.
yeah, they may be able to retract their, what do you call this? Their confession.
Or false confessioning, maybe?
Say
Maybe
that.
lying.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so one thing is, sure, they can always recant, but would it be a good?
Could it be possible that the criminal or suspect could always try to blame it on the detective, saying it pressured them to say that it was committed by them, that they admitted it to the crime because the detective forced them to, in a sense?
Yeah, or they got intimidated or something.
That's another thing, sure. So there could be some type of, somebody could feel pressured to admit to something, and that does happen, and it has happened. But you have to really understand confessions have to be supported by physical evidence or something else, because you can't just go into a jury trial and say, well, this guy confessed, but there's absolutely no other evidence that goes along with it to help prove your case. More chances are you're probably not going to win that particular case. So depending upon what state you're in, a lot of the states really require some type of supporting corroboration or evidence or something to go along with your confession. So that's a really important thing to know. So with that being said, where do we get some of our information? So we're going to talk briefly about some sources of information. So in addition to things like physical evidence, there really are three primary areas or sources of information that are available to you kind of at the beginning of an investigation. And the first would be reports. When you write a report, that's going to create a record. It's going to go into a database, and that's going to be a source of information not only for you, but perhaps another investigator or officer or even another agency. There are lots of different, arrest records are definitely a source of information. There's a ton of different databases that are out there that help you in policing to get information that you need. So reports, records, and databases, that's kind of one category. The second would be those who are not suspects in a crime, but they know something about the crime. And that could be a reporting party, that could be a witness. They're not a suspect, they're not involved, but they do know something. It could even be a relative. So this is another really good source of information. And then finally, go ahead.
I have a question.
Sure.
So you know how we're talking about interrogation and everything? How does that connect to like when you're working for like Homeland Security, or how does that connect to interrogation? That's my question.
Well, your question is good, but it's really broad. So, I mean, there's different rules. Federal officers have a little bit more leeway than municipal or state police officers. And there are some things that they can do that perhaps local law enforcement can't do. But, at the end of the day, a lot of the rules are the same. So, you can't twist people's arms. You can't intimidate them. And if that is found out by the court, then of course you run the risk of your case being thrown out of court.
Yeah.
So, but when it comes to Homeland Security, there are a few other things that are allowable in that retrospect versus as a regular patrol officer or detective working for your standard police department. Does that kind of help?
A little bit, yeah. That clears a little bit
Okay.
the difference between like law enforcement and Homeland.
I have a quick question before we go on with the slide. I was trying to pick up the slide on our files, but my slides look totally different from your slides. The PowerPoints.
I'll go back in there and make sure that it's the right one. I'll double check it. It could have been. I could have actually uploaded the wrong one. That is possible. So
Yeah,
I'll.
because I was trying to follow along, but I was like, why are mine like blue and white and yours is like brown and
Well, there's
gray?
two. There should be two PowerPoints.
There is two PowerPoints. The other one's from the criminal procedure.
Yeah.
And there's this
So
one.
where would I find this PowerPoint at?
It should be on the same page that you found it. The other one. There should be two PowerPoints that are there. One is, and they should be right. One is right next to the other one. So, we'll check that before the end of the session tonight, and I'll jump in there and make sure that it's there.
Okay, thank you.
And then your last area, just kind of getting back into it, would be the suspects in the crime, and don't eliminate suspects as a great source of information, because if you are a good interrogator, you're going to be able to elicit the information that you need. So these are typically three kind of areas, and just digging a little bit deeper, I wanted you to kind of know what some of these reports, records, and databases are. So at a local level, an important information source would be all the records that we keep in our local police departments. If you ever get a traffic ticket, it's put into a database in a police department. If you've had your license suspended or something, the DMV keeps a record of something like that. That's a database. But for local police departments, they keep crime reports, investigative reports, follow-up reports, any arrest reports. They also keep what they call MO files, which would be modus operandi, meaning how people operate, how certain crimes are committed. They keep fingerprint files, they keep gun registration files and wanted bulletins, and all of these are different kind of records and reports that you can get to help you, conduct your investigation. Along with that, there's other things like some businesses have what they call shrinkage systems. So these are auto tracking systems. If people are stealing or embezzling money, they can start to see that property is missing. So that's another good one. Caller ID. You guys have that on your phones, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you have caller ID. that's where a phone number is placed. We can get that information, even if the call isn't picked up. So there's a lot of good databases that are out there. So we can, if somebody denies calling someone, we can actually dispute that. So caller ID is a good one. Then we have some other things that are kind of cool. We have something that's called a PIN register. And this is an electronic device that records every phone number dialed from a phone line. So we can tell what numbers people are calling. We also have something called dialed number recorders. They're DNRs. And this is something that can simultaneously monitor call activity on a bunch of different lines. And it's also available to wiretap, which means that someone, if they get a warrant, they can listen in on your telephone call. So these are all investigative aids to help you get information for your report. And if you wanted to know what a DNR looks like, it's just a little box. It looks like this. And the investigator can hook it up to a phone and track phone numbers for people calling, whether it's drug smugglers, etc. So these are different things that you can use. Sometimes they're really small. So this is a really kind of a small one. Sometimes they're a little bit larger. But again, these are all tools that we can kind of use on the investigative side. Some state resources that are out there and federal resources for your investigation could be DMV. Anybody want to figure out why would we want to contact DMV? What information can they give us?
License plates, like information about the car, maybe.
Okay, so information about the car. What else?
Did you have a fingerprint on file?
Yeah, so you can get a fingerprint, which is actually good. So and that's important. What else?
An address.
An address. What else? It's an easy one.
Your picture.
A picture. Yeah, a lot of times if we're not sure, we might have a name, but we don't have a photo. So we'll get a hold of DMV and we'll run the name through DMV and they can give us a picture. It's not always 100% accurate, but that helps. Department of Corrections is another resource for us. Why is that? What information can we get from Department of Corrections?
If he was ever in prison.
Okay. Yeah, if he or she was in prison and what for. Anything else? What other good information could we get?
If they were like associated with any other people or like, I don't know, like known gang members or anything while they were in prison.
Yep, that's a good answer. So who they're hanging out with, that's great. So and if they're an admitted gang member, when somebody ends up going to prison, they're classified, meaning that as they go in, they're asked if they're in any type of gang, and a lot of times they'll admit that because they want to be in the right area of the prison. They don't want to be in an area where they might get injured by a rival gang member, so they're more apt to say, yes, I am, tell them what gang, etc. They won't tell the street cop that, but they'll tell the prison folks that. And that makes sense. And then there's one other really interesting thing that I want to see if you can get. Department of Corrections, what other information could we get? And Irene, you had it on affiliates in the prison, but what else?
Tattoos that they have.
Oh, that's a good one too. Tattoos.
Other crimes they have committed.
Okay, that's good too.
Out of state warrants.
A little bit.
Family members?
Ah, who said that?
Me,
Okay, who's me?
Zena.
Okay. All right, good. So when you go to check in, you have to sign in. So if people come visit them, whether they're partners in crime or family members, not that their family members are partners in crime, but that's another lead or another person that you could be able to talk to. So Department of Corrections is really good. Social Security Administration, FBI, just to kind of run down some other ones, ATF, DEA, Department of Homeland Security, DHS, all of these are other state or federal agencies that you can get information on. And these are really, really good resources. And then, of course, don't forget about the internet. You can almost find pretty much anything, right, on the internet. there's a lot of helpful sites that you can actually, that are free, that you can run somebody's name through and get their property tax information. It's kind of interesting. And you can also use the internet to help you by getting information out. So if there's a kidnapping or something like that, you can all, there are ways to get information out really, really quick. Some of you have probably had an alert on your phone go off before, maybe because a child was kidnapped or something like that. The technology nowadays is really, really good when it comes to kind of helping us out. Okay, so the next group that we'll talk about, just going a little bit deeper with that group, would be, in addition to reports, records, databases, and internet resources, investigators obtain information from people who are associated with the investigation. And I ask who they might be, but it kind of says up top. So, the victim, of course, can give you information. The complainant, who is usually the reporting party, the person that calls, not necessarily the victim, and maybe not necessarily a witness, but maybe they just heard something, so they picked up the phone and they called. So that would be the reporting party or the complainant, and then of course a witness. So all of these are individuals that have good information for you. And here I kind of broke it down where you can look at it in a little bit more detail. So the victim is the person that's the crime was committed against, or the person that was injured. The complainant, as I said, is the person who wants some kind of action to be taken. So they're kind of the reporting party. And these can cross over a little bit. The victim can also be the reporting party. And then a witness, that's a person who saw the crime or some part of the crime, but they're not involved in the crime. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? So these are again, great sources of information. And one of the better sources that we have, and typically we use this on shooting calls and things like that, would be what we call a neighborhood canvass. And this is one of a really good way to solve a crime, is to go door to door. And if you watch any police movies, which some or shows, which some of you probably do, you've seen the officers go door to door talking to people. And of course, some people are more forthcoming with information versus others. But this really is one of the first things that a detective or an investigator should do. And it's a great tool. And again, you carry a bunch of business cards with you because sometimes people don't want to talk to you at the door. So you can always slip them a business card and just tell them, hey, give me a call later on and we can meet somewhere else, or we can talk over the phone, because, people don't want to be seen maybe talking to law enforcement or something like that. But a neighborhood canvass is really a great way to get information. And I just kind of threw in some pictures. Sometimes it's searching. It's a little more searching, but sometimes it's just going around and talking to people and trying to see or find out if they saw anything, heard anything, etc. So that's the neighborhood canvass. We also have something called a knock and talk, and this is a little controversial. And this is another practice that's used to get information. And it usually takes place at the person of interest's home or the suspect's house. And it's generally considered a consensual encounter, and I put the case to go in there with it. But it's basically where you knock on the door and you're going to talk to somebody that you believe might be involved in the case. You don't really have to read them their rights yet because they're not under arrest, so they're not in custody. But you might want to knock on the door and ask them a couple of questions. They call it a knock and talk. And we can talk a little bit more about it later, but just know what a knock and talk is. One thing to kind of be aware of when we're talking about witnesses and victims, etc., be aware that the suspect and witness statements are not always reliable. And sometimes witnesses are sometimes they're very confident in their knowledge of what happened than they are accurate. So they think they know stuff or they saw something, but they're not always 100% accurate. So, adding to that ambiguity is the fact that many people see only a part of a crime. They don't see the whole thing. but a lot of times they testify that they witnessed the whole thing and they didn't. So, and there are a lot of other issues or things that come up with witness identification and things like that, and we're not really going to get into that, but just understand that witnesses, it's great to have a good witness, but they're not always 100% reliable. So you have to kind of just keep that in mind as you're jotting down your notes and taking information. And then one of the last sources as it relates to like people other than the suspect would be what we call a confidential informant. And this is somebody that is formally registered and they are compensated by a police department. And this is another bone of contention with some folks because basically the department is buying information. So it sounds kind of weird, right? Why would we pay someone who knows about criminal activity or might even be partially involved in criminal activity in order to give us information? So it's kind of a catch-22 or a double-edged sword, if you will. We use it a lot for drug buys. So, and what I mean by drug buys is where somebody tells us that, you know, house at 123 North Willow is selling cocaine, and they give us all this good information. We might pay that person to go in the house and buy drugs for us. And then they come back out and give us the drugs. We write a search warrant. We go in and we arrest the people and find drugs. So and you're actually paying the informant or some other type of compensation. And again, it can be money. It could be that they got arrested and they're working off a case. Or maybe they have 2 or 3 cases and you're willing to reduce the number of cases against them. Does that kind of all make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. It's some people think that it's, you know, it's kind of walking the line, but a lot of times you can't get close to the criminals unless you have some criminals sometimes helping you, if that makes any sense. But these are informants, actually can help you a lot of times. And a lot of times it's based on money. You know, when you're dealing with informants, just remember building trust is really key and stuff like that. There is a legal difference, just so you know, between an informant and a confidential, reliable informant. And I know you don't know what it is because this is part of the criminal investigation course, but anybody want to take a stab on what a confidential, reliable informant is?
Maybe an undercover person.
Not necessarily. I mean, they are going to be undercover, but
Someone who is willing to not make a trade, but like work with the police.
okay, that could be a regular informant. What do you think? What do you think that really the difference is? There's one word in there that should kind of tip you off a little bit. Somebody.
Person who doesn't get anything by telling what they know.
That's not it. And I heard somebody say it under their breath, but I don't think they wanted to say it louder.
Reliable informant?
Okay. I think I heard somebody say it. Who said reliable?
Romero here.
Okay. How do you make somebody reliable?
That they're always there when you need them. Like,
Well, that helps,
you
but
have to like draw them in somehow. You know.
You're close.
They've used them before and they've like
Whoever.
They've established it.
Okay, so a couple of you were right on target. So if they've done it before, so if they've given you information before and you wrote a search warrant behind that and you found all kinds of cool stuff and they've done that a couple of times, they are now considered by the court reliable. And that means that the court will recognize them as reliable. And even with these types of informants, if they just tell you something is at a certain place, you can write a search warrant without pretty much doing a lot of corroboration because they've already given you credible information in the past. So that's what a confidential, reliable informant is. You sign them up. Typically, you pay them, and a lot of times they can make some okay money. I'm not advocating for that as a career, of course, because it's very dangerous. But to give you an example, there are informants that we've had that will, let's say, give you information or do a reverse sting buy of, let's say, 10 kilos of cocaine. Now, their payout for that is probably going to be, it could be $10,000. Now that's a lot of money, right? But they're also involved in criminal activity. So I mean, can you see how the line is gray? Yeah. So you have to be very, very careful. But I just wanted to make sure you knew what a confidential, reliable informant is. They're very good, and they're recognized by the court. But they've had to have worked for you before, and given you good information. And the way you establish this reliability, again, you have to corroborate as much as you can. Determine how, where, when, and under what circumstances that informant got the information, and provide statements of informants, etc. But at the end of the day, those confidential informants are really, really good, and they can give you a lot of information. All right,
I'm so sorry, sir.
Go ahead.
So one quick question. So basically, it's not just in the movies, because I thought it's just in the movies. So basically, your police officers can get reliable witnesses or reliable sources from people who are somewhat involved in for example, the drug trade. They're involved also, but they're giving you reliable information against uh, an opposite gang or something.
That's correct.
And okay,
it does happen. Now that's the gray line, though. I mean, you really have to figure out why the person is giving you the information. Are they trying to make more money on in their area, so they're getting rid of the competition?
Yeah.
Or
it's just in the movies.
No, there are
Surprising.
there are reliable informants that do a lot of work for law enforcement, to get you to the bigger fish, to get more drugs, more guns, more etc. But you have to be careful with it.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to be very careful. And those informants also run the risk of being targeted themselves by their competitors, etc. So it can be a very dangerous thing for them to do.
Okay.
And then finally, when it comes to individuals, the suspect. Okay, that's the person who basically was directly or indirectly connected with the crime by planning it or directing it. And these folks are great sources of information. So don't overlook the suspect as a main or chief source of information. Because if you are a good investigator, you can get a lot of information from a person that commits a crime. So it's important for us to know that. Kind of a little bit more on the suspects, a person with a known MO fitting a crime. These are ways that you can kind of tie your suspects to a crime. There's a really interesting, and we're going to talk a little bit about this thing right here. These are, and we'll talk more when we get into report writing. If you haven't seen what this is what we call an FI card or a field interview card. And these are what officers will typically fill out when they maybe get called to some type of suspicious activity or criminal activity, but they don't have enough to arrest the person. So they fill out these cards, and all of this information will go into a database. So that way, if more information comes out about the suspect, then perhaps we can match up this field interview card with the person that actually committed the crime. So you can see, if they were driving a car, we would fill this part out, any tattoos or, things like that. But these are all on file, and these are great bits of information for you as an investigator, to track down suspects for future crimes. So FI cards are really good. Talking a little bit more about interview and interrogation, just know that an interview, the person is not a suspect, but they know something of value. So an interview is different than an interrogation. Your tactics are going to be a little bit different, right? An interrogation is where somebody is actually suspected of direct involvement in the crime. So without going any further, and we'll get to it in a second, if I'm going to conduct an interview of a witness, do they have to be advised of their constitutional rights, do you think?
No,
Why not?
because they're not suspects yet.
Okay. I mean,
We're just getting information from them.
that's one way to look at it.
They're not in custody.
And not
yet.
placed under arrest.
Right. So there's there's a little kind of myth out there that whenever you arrest somebody right away you have to read them their rights. That's not really true, and we'll talk about that. But if you're talking about if you're just interviewing a witness or you're trying to get information, they're not in custody. There's absolutely no reason to read them their rights. Now, if they're in handcuffs in an interview room and you want to talk to them about your case, do you have to read them their rights then?
Yes.
Yes. Now it's very apparent they're in custody and you're going to talk to them about this particular case, so that it kind of switches. So just a little tidbit on the difference between interview and interrogation. And I put this in there. I don't remember if I actually assigned it as an assignment, but this is one of the best videos on interviewing that you'll probably ever watch. I show this in a lot of my classes. We're not going to watch it tonight. But this guy, while he looks really cool and smiley, he is a serial killer, rapist, murder dude, and you won't believe him when you start to listen to the interview on what he actually got away with. And it's a fabulous interview. So if you have time, I would highly suggest that you watch the video on this interview. Okay. Any questions before we move on?
No, sir.
Oh, thank you. Sir makes me sound
I
like.
forgot the sir.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Sir makes me sound like oh, wait, I am 60. Okay, never mind. It just makes me sound older. Okay. So what are some characteristics of a good interviewer or interrogator? Well, adaptability is good. Being culturally adroit or skillful, understanding that people are different. And when you interview some of these folks, you're not going to like maybe what you might have to do. And here's kind of the scenario I'll give you. If you have someone that has been molesting children, let's say for years, and typically it's more of a male, we're going to go with that scenario. When you interview that person, do you think is it better to scream and yell and call them names and all that stuff? Or is it better to speak softly and maybe get closer to the person and kind of tell them that you understand, etc.? Which tactic do you think is better?
Second one.
The second one.
Yeah, you what you want to do is scream and yell and headbutt them or do whatever you're going to do, but you can't do that. So yes, you're going to want to speak softly and try to, as much as you can understand.
Gain his trust.
Absolutely. So, being, adaptable is really, really important. Having some self-control is important. Being patient. How many of you are actually patient? Can you tell me that you're patient?
Me.
Well, that's good. A lot of us, sometimes I'm not. And I have to admit, I'm a little more type A, and sometimes I'm not the most patient individual. So being patient is really important. Having a level of confidence, being objective, which means that not everybody is guilty, and just making sure that you're being objective with the facts. Being sensitive to people's rights. So understanding that there are things that you can do and there are things that you can't do. Importantly, understanding the elements of the crime. So you need to know what you're investigating and what elements that you have to prove, because every crime has a certain element to it. And you have to prove the elements in order to satisfy the court to get a conviction on a crime. So successful questioning then requires kind of two-way communication between the investigator and the person that you're talking to. And you don't have to like them, but you need to be able to communicate with them. So what are some ways that you might prepare or do prior to or during an interview to make a person being questioned maybe more willing to talk to you?
I saw in the video that you provide food.
Yeah, so food is good. And some people think that it's like a bribe. It's not, because if you're going to interview someone for a while, they might get thirsty and they might get hungry. So satisfying that one particular need has been acceptable. Now, you can't hold it over their head and basically say, unless you tell me you can't have this cheeseburger until you admit to the crime. That's not how that works. So you can offer them coffee or water or something to eat in order to make them a little bit more comfortable. So yeah, that's a good one. Anything else?
Or a cigarette to calm themselves down.
Yeah, and even though, yes, we know that it's, you're not supposed to smoke in state buildings and federal buildings, blah, blah, blah. A lot of times we will maybe, take them outside, or I've seen some officers just, hey, smoke this real quick before the jailer comes by, and, and it calms people's nerves. So that's okay. Anything else?
I think for the officers or the interviewer, should I say police officer that does the interview, I think they should yell first or get off steam before they get in there, so that they're calmer.
And it can be frustrating when you're looking into somebody's face and you're asking them a question and they lie right to your face.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's why you
you can
have to be calm first.
you can have them on video and you can see their face, and you could show the person the video and go, "Isn't this you?" "No, that's not me." And it's them. You're looking right at them. So it can be frustrating, but again, at the end of the day, your interview or your interrogation will go a lot further if you are cordial, show a little respect, especially if you're interviewing a gang member. So you don't want to put down their gang or anything else. Your goal at the end of the day is to get somebody to admit lawfully, and so you want to do those things. You could bring them a blanket if they're cold. There are things that you can do. So just understand. What about your questions? Do you think it would be good to write your questions down before you go in to interview someone?
Yes.
Yes.
That's a good thing to do. A lot of young officers don't do that. They walk in there off the cuff and they sit down, and then they start thinking about, oh, what should I. So if you write down your questions first before you go in there,
How about writing your questions like in order of like lighter questions leading up to more heavier questions?
you can do that too.
Working your way up.
You can do that. It's just really, it's a lot easier to take notes and to jot stuff down if you have a question there. And then you won't forget. And you can always add questions as you're going through. But yes, keeping some chronological order, from depending upon which question you want to ask. But it is good to do that. So, and you can start off low if you want, and you can move up to more difficult questions or more pointed questions. But there are things that you can do to prepare. And then there's some barriers, because not everybody wants to talk to you. Even though you're in uniform and you look all cool, or you're in a shirt and tie, or you're, in a dress for ladies or for men or whatever, there are people that don't want to talk to you. They just don't. Sometimes the barriers can be, and this could be witnesses, or this could even be the suspect, but typically witnesses. Some people don't want to be a rat. And if they tell, or snitch on somebody, they think it's wrong. A lot of times there's some prejudicial issues that kind of come into play. Fear. Do you think people are afraid to sometimes talk to the police?
Yeah.
Yes.
It happens. There could be language barriers. And I can't tell you how many times as a supervisor where I saw a young officer that thought he knew how to speak Spanish, and he would try his best, and you could tell the person was not getting it. And if you were to interview somebody or have them do some type of, say, field sobriety test or whatever in a different language and they don't understand, it's going to come out at trial and it's not going to look good. So that's when you get someone that can speak whatever language of the individual that you have, and just make things a lot cleaner. But language is really important. Hearing impaired, the same thing. You might need to get a sign language translator. And all of these are available, but these are some barriers that sometimes kind of come into play. To be effective, though, there's 2 requirements, and guys have a harder problem than ladies. I don't understand. Well, maybe I do. I've been married 25 years, so I probably understand part of this. 2 basic requirements that are important. Number 1, listening. So that's the part that guys, sorry guys, that sometimes we don't quite do as well. And observing. Why is observing in there?
Is it, yeah, like at body language?
Body language is big. It really is, because how people react or act when you talk to them is very telling. Whether they put their hands, put their head on the table or start. I've seen a lot of women that twirl their hair when they get nervous. So they'll start doing this with their, I don't have enough hair to do that, but they'll kind of twirl their hair. Or people blink a lot, or they start to sweat, or whatever. But body language is really, really important. So nonverbal clues, just watching somebody. I used to, in an interview, I would take a paper clip and I would put it on the table in front of the suspect. And what do you think the person would start to do if they got nervous?
Grab the clip.
Yeah, they grab it and start bending it and tweaking it and trying to tie it in a knot and all that stuff like that. And that just shows me that they're extremely nervous. So they didn't have to pick it up, but typically they would. So again, being able to listen and being able to observe. Really quick, as we kind of finish this chapter up, talking about the different types of questions. The textbook gives us, 4 or 5 different types. There's direct, indirect, what we call closed-ended, open-ended, and leading. And I'm going to talk just really briefly about each one of these. A direct question is one that's to the point. You're asking the question, you want an answer. So it's very, very, very to the point, and it doesn't really allow for any misinterpretation. So an example could be, what time did you leave for the house or the restaurant or whatever? You want a time. And, if somebody were to say, well, I left earlier, you would probably, go back around with that and say, well, what time? So that's a direct question where you're asking for something directly. And there's not a lot of wiggle room there. Okay. An indirect question might be a little bit more polite. And with an indirect question, it's kind of meant to elicit a variety of different responses. It's not quite as pointed as a direct question. So it could be something like, how do you and your neighbor get along? So let's say it was a neighbor dispute and somebody, killed the other one or something like that. You may ask the person, well, how do you guys get along? And you can see that that's a little bit more open. It allows the individual to kind of give more information. So that's what we call an indirect question. A closed-ended question is simple. It's yes or no. I want a yes answer, I want a no answer, and I'm not going to take a maybe. So, and maybe even a short response, but, did you get along with your neighbor? Yes or no? So that's kind of a closed-ended question. Or did you go straight home after work? Yes or no? So that's a closed. And then an open-ended question, again, is made to elicit longer, more detailed responses. Maybe, tell me how, why, etc. An example could be, what can you tell me about your relationship with your neighbor? So that's kind of an example of an open-ended question. And then finally, a leading question. And this is what a lot of officers tend to do, and we're not supposed to do this. Anybody know what a leading question is? What I mean by when we talk about leading?
it's like, aren't you something like, for example, you're already leading him to to the situation, like you did do this or something like that.
It's that they answer back something that you want them to hear.
Yeah, you're kind of floating it out there already. So what you're doing is you're prompting a person to a specific response, and you kind of imply the answer when you're doing it. So what you're saying here, so an example could be, how much did you have to drink before you went to the job site and assaulted your boss? So what are we already inferring here?
That he drank and he assaulted the
Yeah,
boss.
you're already assuming that. Or if you were to interview somebody, let's say you have some information that a suspect robbed an ATM and they were wearing a black jacket when they ran. As an officer, you don't want to ask them, was the suspect wearing a jacket? Because now you're implying that the person was wearing a jacket. What would be a better question for that?
Do you know if the suspect had on a jacket?
Yeah, and then you could ask him even what color. I mean, so you could go more. So what you don't want to do is just kind of lead somebody down the road and kind of give, imply that you're kind of throwing the answer in there already. Okay, finishing up real quick, talking about Miranda and even videotaping. Recording and videotaping interviews and interrogations. A lot of agencies do it. Almost all of them that I know do this. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of them have body cameras now, and that's something kind of new that agencies are dealing with because you are videotaping somebody. But it is, not only do they have policies, but what would be the reason that you would videotape an interview or an interrogation?
In case an incident happens during the interview?
That could be one. That's good. Yes, in case something happens. What else?
Maybe
For
something
Training
proof.
purposes.
Someone else? I thought I heard it.
If the
For
suspect
proof.
lying in the court, you can use that as evidence to say that he said another thing to say, like, for example, if he says something about he didn't commit the crime, but you caught it on tape saying that he did commit the crime.
Okay.
And he's giving you examples.
All right. Yeah, people recant their stories a lot of times, or they change their mind. So anything else you can think of?
Go back and review it and make sure you didn't miss anything important.
Yeah.
Body language or anything like that.
That's good, Alec. You can always go back and look at your own interview, because you could go re-interview the person if you miss some questions. Because after you interview somebody, you're going to sit there for a minute. You're going to go, oh, dang it. I should have asked them this. So you could always go back. But, looking at the body language, watching them stare at the ceiling, getting all nervous, all of these things are good, good reasons. And all the points you did, people recant. So that's one. We don't want the court to think that we intimidated somebody. So if we have it on video, they can see that there were no threats of intimidation, etc. So there's really good reasons for things like that. There's also one other reason that's kind of far out there, but it does happen every once in a while. So let's say we have a homicide case and we have, let's say it's a drive-by shooting and the person hasn't died yet. And we're going to interview these people and we want to interview the suspects on video. Why video? Let's say it's gang related. Let me try to help you a little.
Emotionally act.
So they don't, it's kind of like not being like a rat type, like a narc, or so like they don't get targeted from their own gang for saying something.
That's not bad. That's not quite what I was looking for.
Getting them to admit to doing it, thinking like basically they were going to get like props, I guess, with their gang before the person dies, and they know they're going to be charged with murder.
Okay, that's sort of there. you're kind of on track. Do you think it's ever happened where well, first of all, do you think court cases happen like really fast? Meaning like, they go to court the next day, they have the trial the next day, they're found guilty the next day, or do sometimes they drag out for years?
You drag it
They
out.
drag out.
Yeah. So sometimes these cases, the person may not go to trial for 5, 6, 7 years down the line. Do you think during that time witnesses disappear or people die?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's another good reason to videotape an interview, because you can use that interview in court. So that's another.
How about like if another jurisdiction needs that, like if the crime crosses lines or something, does that ever happen?
It does. And you can pass off a copy of your recording to the other investigators. So that's always, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to videotape, but these are all good reasons for doing that. Okay. So I have just a couple of photos of interviews. A lot of these rooms, just so you know, they're set up with cameras. We have body cameras now. So we do have to be, understanding that, and most people can recognize a body camera. Typically, almost every interview room you're in is going to have some type of audio or video. It's not against the law. There's no expectation of privacy. So you can put somebody in a room, or actually you could put two suspects. If they commit a crime, you can stick them in a room and let them talk. And if they talk about covering up the crime and all that kind of stuff, you can use that at trial. So there's all these, things, and most people know, well, I guess not most, but a lot of people that have been through the system know that there's going to be some type of recording device or something in there. Really quick, just to kind of give you some things that we can do, and then we'll kind of move on and we'll finish up. If I arrest somebody, let's say I arrest two people for, let's say, an ATM robbery, and I put them both in the back seat of my car, do you think it would be allowable for me to throw a tape recorder under the seat in the back seat of the police car and just let it play without telling them?
No, because you're not telling them.
Yes.
Isn't that like illegal?
Okay, so I have a no. I heard a yes.
Expectation of privacy.
Who said that?
Maxwell.
Maxwell, is there an expectation of privacy in the backseat of a police car?
No, sir.
Yeah, there's not. So, again, there are things that we can do and things that we can't do, but we've done that before, where you put a tape recorder in the car, you put the two suspects in the back seat, and they start talking about, hey, don't say anything. Hey, don't do this. Hey, don't do that. And that is totally admissible. So, again, those are things that we can do and that have been deemed lawful because there is no expectation of privacy. And then we'll talk about some things that we can't do as we get further kind of down the line. But okay, real quick, just for the interview itself, establish, your statements ahead of time. It's always great to do that. Typically, you want to interview the reporting party, the witness and the victim, and then the suspect. It doesn't always have to be in that order, but you don't want to interview your suspect first. You want to get as much information about what happened from all the other individuals before you go in and talk to your suspect. That way you have a lot of information. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. There's a little thing down here talking about separating witnesses. Why is it important that we separate people?
That they don't have time to rehearse a story and make sure that they say the same things.
Yeah, sometimes, and that's with witnesses too, because sometimes a witness will say, hey, did you see what happened? I saw the guy with a gun. Well, yeah, so did I. Well, what color? They start talking about it. And then that kind of just makes things a lot more difficult to get through. So it's always important that you separate not only suspects, but you separate witnesses so they can't they can't talk about things beforehand. Sometimes you can't always do it, but you do the best you can to separate stuff. Plan ahead, like we talked about. If you have any other information, reports to review before you do an interview, it's great to do that. Select the time and the place for the interview. Make sure that your scene is safe when you're talking to witnesses or suspects, etc. Typically, most people recall things right away. So that's why if it's a witness or a reporting party, you can talk to them in the field. But if you want to do a more in-depth interview, you're going to want to take them back to the station and have them talk to you more, maybe even put them on tape so that way they can't change their story, etc. But again, the sooner you can interview people, the better. You don't want to wait 2 weeks and then go talk to somebody, because we tend to forget certain things. When you conduct your interview, be friendly, but professional. Show some ID when you're talking to people so they know who you are, especially if you're a detective and you don't have, you're not wearing a uniform, etc. And this is more, again, talking, an interview. This isn't like a suspect. This is more just kind of an interview. Establish rapport with people. Listen. Again, it's important that you have a good rapport and you're interested. Have you ever talked to somebody and they're not paying attention to you?
Yes.
Okay, so I mean, and a lot of us have. So that it's important that, if we're talking to someone, that, if they're talking to us, that we're paying attention to them. And we're looking at them and we're making eye contact and we're taking notes, and we're going to learn more about how to take notes as we kind of go through the semester. If you have a reluctant witness, you can kind of reassure them. A lot of times you can use you can use something called a logical approach, which is based on reason. When you talk to them, the reason you're doing this is to help clear up this crime. This is a violent criminal. We want to get information, etc. Sometimes there's an emotional approach. So all of these are things to look at. Typically for bigger crimes like homicides, shootings, sexual assaults, we use what we call the cognitive interview. And you don't need to know all the ins and outs on that, but this is one it's secluded, meaning it's in an interview room with just maybe you, another investigator, and the person that you're talking to, free of distractions, and it takes a little while to do this interview. It's going to be a longer interview, so that's kind of the basis of what they call a cognitive interview. Let's see. When you're done talking to somebody, of course, make sure that you thank them. When you talk about interrogation, so that was an interview. If you're going to interrogate somebody, this is an important thing to remember. Before you interrogate any suspect in custody, you have to Mirandize them. So I made a little thing that says custody plus interrogation equals Miranda. If you're missing one of those parts, you don't have to advise them of their rights. You can, but you don't have to. If they're not in custody, you don't have to advise them of their rights. If you're not interrogating them about that case, you don't have to advise them of their rights. And again, on TV, you've probably seen it where, the car chase, the foot chase, they arrest the person, they stand them up in the field and they go, you have the right to remain silent. You don't have to Mirandize them in the field because you want to wait till you get them back to the station. Does that make sense? In a controlled environment, in an interview room where you can videotape them, etc. So that's the basis for Miranda.
But excuse me, sir. Excuse me.
Mhm.
Sorry. But before you're able to put the handcuffs on, you're supposed to read them the Miranda rights, right?
No, that's absolutely false.
No?
If somebody commits a robbery and you chase them down the street with a gun and you tackle them and handcuff them, they already know they're under arrest now. You can tell them you're under arrest for robbery after you brush them off and stand them up, but you don't have to Mirandize them until you're going to interrogate them. They're already in custody. You chased them, you handcuffed them, so they're in custody. They're not free to leave, but you don't have to Mirandize them. Once you put the handcuffs on, you don't have to Mirandize them right away.
So they cannot use that against you when during the what do you call this, when you're in court.
Right. So you're fine. Now, if you get them back to the station and you put them in a chair and they're in custody and you say, I want to talk about the robbery, you have to Mirandize them now before you can talk to them about that. Because you don't want to do a big interview in the field with all those people around, all the distractions. It doesn't make any sense. It's better to get them back. So what you see on TV isn't always accurate like that.
No, because sometimes I'm so sorry. I'm answering again.
Sure.
Because sometimes with this generation right now, where everybody has cell phone video and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
they would video and say, "Hey, you did read the Miranda rights."
That's
You
right,
know,
but
they know the rights.
you're
So
exactly right. But the rights are, before you interrogate someone in custody, you have to issue them the warning. So if you're not interrogating them, you don't have to. You can handcuff them, put them in the car, drive them to the station, take them to an interview room, give them a cup of coffee, and then when you sit down to talk to them, you would have to Mirandize them before you start interrogating.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because we've been watching some videos about unruly people, and some other people around the vicinity are yelling, they're in handcuffs. Why are you putting them in handcuffs?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of like, now that you mentioned about the Miranda rights, and not reading them even if you handcuff them, now I kind of like got confused with that, because with the one that I remember watching before,
Mm-hmm.
that the people around the actual incident were yelling, read them the Miranda rights,
Yeah.
to the police.
Yep. And
So
that's okay. People can yell and scream all they want. You don't have to do anything until you start to talk to them.
okay, all right,
Okay.
thank you.
So there are times, just really quick, and then we'll be done and we'll take a short break. There are times where Miranda doesn't apply, and that's voluntary, unsolicited, or spontaneous statements. And spontaneous means, like, if I chase you down because you robbed the liquor store and I tackle you and I stand you up and right away you say, I didn't rob that guy. I didn't say anything to you. You just blurted that out. The court will allow that because I really didn't have time to even do anything. That's what we call a spontaneous statement. So that's an important thing to remember. If you have handcuffed people in the back of your car and they just start talking, officer, are you listening to me? Officer, I killed the guy. It was self-defense. I did this, I did that. And you say absolutely nothing. Are you going to be able to use that statement in court? That was a very timid yes, whoever said that.
I would say no, because what if that person's declared having mental issues?
Okay.
And then that's going to become a whole other issue.
That could be something
saying,
that,
well, because he wasn't mentally stable, he didn't know what he was saying or understood, and blah blah blah.
yeah, and that could come up, but that would be a spontaneous statement that you could more than likely try to get in, because you're not interrogating the person if they're just talking. But if it does turn out later that they were, that there's something mentally wrong with them, that could be a challenge on the defense side. But just understand that there are times where you don't have to Mirandize somebody. Like when I take fingerprints. If you're under arrest and I take your fingerprints, I don't have to Mirandize you to take your fingerprints. If I do a handwriting exemplar, or I do a lineup, or a sobriety test, you don't have to advise someone of their rights in order to administer a field sobriety test. Only after, if you interrogate the person, you would have to read them their rights. Does that kind of make sense? So spontaneous statements or admissions are typically outside of the scope of Miranda. Now, it doesn't mean they can't be challenged, but typically they're outside of the scope. If you're going to do a test like a DUI, and an intoxication test or a fingerprinting, etc., we don't have to Mirandize you for that. So those are just a couple of things where they're not required. When you do read someone their rights, understand that you have to be able to show that they really understood you reading them. So if there's a language barrier, could that cause you to have an issue with Miranda? Yeah, definitely. Okay. And, a really important part here, if somebody's going to waive their rights, meaning that they're going to go ahead and talk to you, silence is not a waiver. So if I read someone their rights and say, do you understand? And they just stare at me and don't say anything, I can't just assume that they're waiving their right. So if they're quiet, it needs to be intelligently and knowingly. So you have to know that they understood that they were giving up their right to remain silent. So a lot of times departments they have a Miranda form, a waiver form, where the person will sign it. So, and we'll talk about that more as we get into kind of our reports. There is something that's unconstitutional. I told you I'd kind of look at both sides of the spectrum here really quick. If an officer questions somebody without Miranda and gets a statement, let's say a confession, and then after they get the confession, they Mirandize the person and then re-ask the question, that's illegal. That's unconstitutional, and that should make sense to everybody. You can't get your information first and then Mirandize somebody and have them repeat what they said. You have to read them their rights first and then have them knowingly and intelligently waive their rights and then go from there. There is one other exception, and that's called the public safety exception. And that's basically based off of this case, New York versus Quarles. And that typically occurs when there's some type of safety issue at hand. So I think I have a photo here somewhere. I thought I did. Okay, maybe I don't. Maybe I have it in a different one. Where did I? Okay. So this typically takes place when, let's say somebody is running from law enforcement, they're armed and they throw a gun on a roof or over a fence or something. And then by the time the police officer catches up, the person doesn't have the gun anymore. There's a public safety exception out there that says that you can ask the individual what they did with the firearm, because is it possible that it could fly into a backyard and some little kid could pick it up and shoot themselves?
Yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes. So that exception, and that only exception, has to be limited to safety. You have to show that there was a safety issue, and you can only ask about what they did with it. You can't ask them anything else. Did you rob the store, or did you do this? You can only ask them a question about the safety issue. And they don't have to answer you, of course, but that public safety exception, you don't have to Mirandize somebody for that. Anything outside of that, you're going to have to. So that's just kind of a quick, interesting little fact right there. Let's see here. Let me see if there's anything else I want to cover before the break. We talked about selecting the time and place, both with interviews and interrogations. Think about what you want in your interview room. Some interview rooms have a lot of furniture, some have less for safety reasons, so the person can't, throw a chair at you or something like that. We talk about how you might set up for, let's say, a child predator case. You may want to get closer, maybe sit on the same side. I know it's weird, as the suspect. Okay, so I mean, these are little tidbits or things like that. Be professional, but show that you're in command. Watch their nonverbal communication again. A lot of times, there's some things that you can do to help you in interviews. You can ask these direct questions. You can kind of project the blame on somebody else. You can rationalize. These are all legal things to do. Like, I know why you did it. I know you're hurting. It's this. I understand why. So you can kind of minimize it. And that's considered to be legal. So these are just kind of little tidbits that you can do. You can make the person, again, feel comfortable. These are all things that are okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Do they still frown upon like turning the heat up or like eating in front of them or anything like that?
Yeah, when I first started and that's a long time ago, guys. So I'm not going to give I already gave my age away. But yeah, a tactic a long time ago I don't remember the turn the heat up one, although I'm sure it's been used before. But I've seen detectives that would eat in front of someone, and that's really it's pushing the envelope. It doesn't mean that you can't, but you really shouldn't. But again, you're allowed to offer coffee or, water, or you can offer them something to eat, but eating in front of them could be considered a little bit of coercion. Probably depends on the judge, but that's a really good question. The last thing to talk about, and then we'll take our quick break, is ethics and the use of deception. So this is going to be an interesting question, and some of you are going to like the answer and some of you won't, but can law enforcement lie in an interview?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I hear a lot of yeses. Okay. Anybody have a no? All right. So you can't plant evidence, of course, but you can use some deception. And you have to be careful about how you do it. But you can use some limited types of deception, like, hey, I already talked to your friend and he already told me that you guys robbed the bank, when I never talked to him and he never told me that. So, now when you ask those questions, do you think the defense attorney will have, they're going to ask questions of you as well on why you did that, etc. But you can use a little bit of deception when interviewing individuals. So you just have to be careful, though, in doing it. Of course, you can't use physical force. You can't use any psychological abuse. These are things that you have to be very, very careful of. When somebody confesses, it needs to be voluntary. Again, you can't force them into confessing, etc. You can't waterboard somebody. Okay, we probably know that. This is like my favorite movie ever, Taken. You can't, electrocute them or something like that. These are things that we can't do. In the olden days, a million years ago, before I was a cop, I understand that they used to shine a bright light in your face. I never saw that, but I suppose that falls into Maxwell's turning the heat up kind of thing. So these are things that nowadays we just don't do. We'll kind of go past this a little bit. All right, and then really quick, just talking about polygraphs. You can use these, but they're not admissible in court. So if you've never taken a polygraph or seen a polygraph, they basically record your respiration, your breathing, your blood pressure, and your pulse. And most people are extremely nervous when they get hooked up to a polygraph machine, even when they're taking a job interview. You can hear your heart beating in your head, kind of, because it is a little bit scary. But there are certified polygraphers that can do a polygraph, but you can use it for investigative tools only and leads, but it's not been proven 100%, therefore it's not admissible in court. So kind of an interesting thing there.
Can it be used to get a warrant?
Not just by itself. It can be something that you can add in with other corroborating information, but just the mere fact somebody didn't pass a polygraph is not enough in itself to grant you a search warrant from a judge. Okay, so with that said, it's what is it, about 8:20-ish, give or take. Let's take 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit about the legal side, and I'll get you through that fairly quick, and then we'll be done for tonight. So let's just call it 8:30, and you can blank your screen out or whatever you want to do, and then we'll come back at 8:30, and then we'll finish up. Sound good, everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's do that.